It's recording?
It's recording, I hope so. So, hello to everyone. Thank you very much for attending today's lecture in the Bertalanffy Center. I'm the Managing Director of the Bertalanffy Center, and just some words for what is the room you are here. The Bertalanffy Center is an independent research institute, privately funded, and we are dedicated to the advancement of system science and design. And we have a broad spectrum from the philosophy of science to the application of systems interventions, and also very broad from different domain perspectives. But today, I'm very happy that Kade last followed our invitation to Vienna from Brussels. You will introduce yourself more shortly. And I'm very glad because I met Kade at a joint venture or adventure we took, that is the Thinking School of the Montparnasse Initiative in Paris, where I was invited this summer, and I found his perspectives quite provocative, but also very insightful, and this is why I'm very happy to be here today. So Cadel, the next 2 hours are yours, and thanks also to the online participation we have today, and we will record the meeting, and we will also provide this recording later on.
Sure.
Thank you, Cadel.
Okay. Well, thanks for the introduction, and thanks. There's more people here than I thought would show up, but it's nice to see everyone. So the title of, well, first I introduce myself. This is sort of the first time actually I'm going to be describing my thesis. The thesis is a culmination of 4 years of research, but really something that's been like a lifetime project for me, which has been, I always say that my academic interest has been structured between wondering about the evolution of humanity and why we're so different than nature, or so strange in nature. I've always felt like humans are a very strange species. And then the sort of second half of my research, trying to understand the consequences of that difference and trying to understand the future of humanity. So the thesis as a whole is kind of like a meditation on at least my attempt to articulate an understanding of universal history and how it informs potential speculations into the future. And then towards the end of the thesis, I tried to bring it back around to the present and try to meditate on what that might mean for us in the present day. And where I did my PhD thesis, the reason why the title is Global Brain Singularity is because I did my PhD thesis at an institute called the Global Brain Institute in Brussels under supervisor Francis Heiligen, who's a cyberneticist. So you can look him up online if you want. He supervised my work. And he influenced me, and the idea of the global brain influenced me because I was always interested in the future of technology. And I was also interested in systems and holistic perspectives. And the idea of the global brain was sort of a framework or a perspective where I could explore the future of technology in a holistic way without just focusing on artificial intelligence, or like many technological singularity people do, just focusing on, say, artificial general intelligence and sort of either an antagonistic or a sort of an evolutionary perspective where artificial general intelligence is seen as our successors or our evolutionary, overlords or something like that. So the global brain was an idea where basically it was inspired by a metaphor from neuroscience. Inspired by a metaphor from neuroscience, where just in the same way that neurons connect in our brain to produce emergent patterns of consciousness and intelligence and goal-directedness in a distributed pattern, the idea is that humans connect on the internet in the same way, and so that humans connected on the internet form a type of global brain or a type of nervous system, and that this is a type of a unified medium, in the sense that all humans connecting to the internet are on one interconnected surface, which allows for emergent levels of intelligence, consciousness, and goal directedness potentially. So first, my connection with Stefan and the Bertalanffy Center was that in the culmination of writing my thesis, a lot of the themes that emerged for me in terms of meditating on the present align with some of the things that Stefan told me are the central attractors or the central goals for the Bertalanffy Center, which is sort of designing attractive creation spaces, trying to find a way to talk about second order science, which to me is just including the observer within the system, and then to focus on the nature of consciousness-driven transformations, which for me is, instead of talking about or thinking about how consciousness is produced by a particular material substrate, to think about the way in which consciousness is dynamically transforming in the historical appearances itself. So it shifts the attention away, say, from the neuronal substrate to the transformations itself, and then mysteries of reality, that when you include the observer within the system, and when you're thinking about consciousness-driven transformations, how does that get you to challenge sort of notions of reality and what is real? But I'm just going to go to this. So when I was sort of thinking about my journey through writing the thesis, I came down on this question, or this divide that has structured a lot of knowledge in the modern world, which is this difference between this idea of what is the world versus how to act in the world, and sort of realizing that these two questions are, in some sense, like the philosopher David Hume said, sort of that you can't derive an ought from an is, or you can't derive values for action from what is in the world. So like, for example, with like the Bertalanffy Center for Systems Science, you could say, what is the world? You could say like a multi-level hierarchy of interacting systems, but that doesn't necessarily tell you or allow you to derive rules for action or how to be a good person in the world. They're sort of disconnected questions. So like the evolutionary theorist Stephen Jay Gould said that facts and values are non-overlapping areas of magisteria, or something like this. And I wanted to start to approach this question towards the end of the thesis, but I wanted to situate that within sort of the systems theory perspective. So what I focus on basically is not just what is the world, say in the systems theory perspective, some multi-level hierarchy of interacting systems, but what are the consequences of human action in the world? What are the consequences of all humans on the planet and our technological interventions and our consciousness transformations, and trying to basically get at the meaning of that overlap. So the structure of the thesis is in 4 parts. The first part attempts to contextualize the present through an attempt at a universal history, which inspired me through cosmic evolution and big history, the subjects of cosmic evolution and big history. The second part tries to take that foundation from cosmic evolution and big history and tries to situate an analysis of what's going on in the present, which is sort of the challenges of technological complexification and global convergence, but framed within sort of a universal history. The fourth part tries to articulate an attempt to understand, through understanding cosmic evolution, how we could understand a potential future form of evolution. And then the final part attempts to bring a conversation back to the present moment and sort of meditating on what does it how can a conversation be structured after sort of reflecting on the total past and the total future? Is the video okay? Okay. So to sort of start off, like everything for me in relation to the global brain idea was sort of related to this idea that in our present moment, we are dealing with a radical technological complexification. So in the last 10, 20, 30 years, our world's becoming extremely complex, largely because of new technologies emerging, and that in the future, we should expect the world to get increasingly complex again because of technological complexification. So in the past, obviously, the emergence of the internet, computers are everywhere, and everyone is constantly online, and we're constantly looking at surfaces. And then going into the future, of course, there's whole suites of technologies that we can't predict, that we can't imagine what will emerge, but things like nanotechnology, genetic engineering, robotics, artificial intelligence. There's a suite of technologies that are emerging, and we can't understand it through reductionist analysis because everything's connected to everything else in this world, and we need some sort of systemic way to understand the relationship between all of these technologies. And then the other process of global convergence, which is that humans aren't isolated anymore. All of the different places on the planet are connected to everything else. Information's being transferred everywhere simultaneously, and we can communicate instantaneously. So what are the consequences of that for our social lives, our psychical lives, our political lives, etc.? So the first thing I wanted to do was to approach that question through the lens that the universe is a set or network of evolving systems that are connected. To apply that perspective, do you get any new insight into problems that we all face on a day-to-day basis related to technological complexification and global convergence? Does that give any different insight? And then the thing that sort of motivated me as well was that when you think about these problems and think about problems like where science breaks down at this horizon, is to me related to prediction versus thinking things like potentiality and possibility. So one of the things I first thought when I started to get interested in science was that, you know, I thought it was strange that cosmologists, for example, could predict, you know, where any galaxy would be billions of years from now, but that we couldn't predict where humans would be 50 years from now. So there's something about the human system related to our complexification and related to our evolution that makes us very strange in relation to everything else. Like even if you can't make exact predictions in biology the way you can in physics, evolutionary biologists could still make general predictions that would hold over millions of years just through the mechanism of natural selection. But again, when you bring it to the horizon of the 21st century, there's no one on the planet who has any coherent idea of what the human system will look like in a century from now. No one knows what the human system will look like in the 22nd century. So there's something really strange about us, and then it sort of brings me to this idea of a potential or a possibility space, and how do we sort of understand this space? So in talking about a universal history, my starting point was an evolutionary framework, this idea that we can, instead of just thinking about evolution as and this is something that systems theorists have long done, I think, from Bertalanffy and as a pioneer of that, was thinking about evolution far more generally than just biology, and thinking about evolution as something that transcends one categorization scheme, that it's something that physics evolves, chemistry evolves, biology evolves, society evolves, culture evolves, technology evolves. They're all one, it's all part of one large process. And then sort of with that framework, at least as a starting point, not saying it's an undeconstructible framework, but just that idea as a starting point, as a way for us to sort of break the divide between reductionist science and what I would call postmodern humanities. So with reductionist science, on the one hand, you have this idea that everything in the universe can be reduced to its most fundamental constituents, which ultimately comes up in quantum gravity researches like subatomic particles and things like this, and that the most fundamental reality is subatomic particles, and we can derive everything else as epiphenomenal from understanding this, whereas postmodern humanities tries to basically deconstruct every universal narrative as an illusory contingent system of power, which is historically contingent. And so this idea that with an evolutionary framework, you can have a sort of unified sort of perspective on our past and why we're here, was at least a starting point for me to then make the necessary presuppositions or to derive speculative ideas about something like a common future, or a way of thinking about a common future, to approach universals again. So in like a big history narrative, if you guys know, big history is a newer subject which basically tries to employ these presuppositions, and they construct a narrative of Big Bang to global civilization, and they try to develop the analytical tools that would help us understand the common patterns between the start of the universe and the present moment, and try to see if when we remove our analysis from just individual reductionist subjects like physics and chemistry and biology and so forth, whether there are new patterns that we see that connect sort of all the processes together, which is again something that I think is something system scientists have tried to do as well. In my analysis in the thesis, what you get from this difference between the reductionist cosmological view and the big historical view is in some sense quite useful to think and quite interesting to think, which is, for maybe more than a century now, the cosmological view of the universe gives you this idea that everything is going to head to disorder. So this is like the idea, it's very, I think most people know about it, there's this idea of a thermodynamic heat death, that where the universe is going is this type of totally disordered state, that in the end, there's basically not enough matter and energy in the universe to bring everything back into each other and to keep it into any sort of ordered configuration, that over the course of trillions of years, basically everything will break apart and fall down, and there'll be no relations. So if we entertain an ontology of relationality, that everything in the universe is sort of understood in a relational framework, at the end of the universe in a cosmological view, there'll be no relations. Nothing will be relating to anything else. But in the big historical view, what sort of unifies everything is the opposite of that. And in the big historical view, things become more intensely relational. That things start relating in more complex ways. So you could have, like, from the start of the universe, you could have subatomic particles relating with each other very intensely, things like quarks and gluons. And then as things complexify, you'll get more and more complex relations, basically. So you'll have protons forming, and you'll have more complex atoms forming, like hydrogen and helium. You'll have the chemical, what we call today the periodic table of elements, and all of those complex relations. And then you'll have, of course, the emergence of life and biology. And you know, anyone who's studied cell biology knows how complex just a cell is, all of the relations that need to be just in the right place in order for a cell to function. Of course, then when you even step up from a cell to a multicellular organism or an ecology of organisms, the relations are even more complex. And then when you think about human civilization and 7 billion people, all self-conscious, all with, you know, creative ideas, all with intimate histories and complex understandings of past and future and all these things, it just gets really complex. And then our lives are becoming more and more complex as social life, as things intensify. So there's this idea, which is basically that with a reductionist cosmological view, you get this view that everything's heading to nothingness. You get this view that everything's heading to no relations. And in the big historical view, the cosmic evolution view, you get the opposite view, which is things are heading to really complex relations, and like relations that are so complex that we can't make any predictions about what's going to happen with that. And so like, and obviously when you think about your own life, like what is our lives if not like the relations we form with others, obviously, and like they're the most important things, and like they're the most complex things, like, you know, your relationship with your mother and your father and the people you love, and your, you know, it's really complex. And so like, and be able to hold that across time, right? Like it's not easy. And so then basically I'm trying to say, like with the big historical view, is like in the cosmological view, we're thinking the universal significance of fundamental reality. And then I'm saying like, we don't often think, and I think systems theory offers us this perspective, we don't often think about the universal significance of things like psychology and sociology and technology as a universally significant phenomena, like in the big picture thing, like, and that's the most important things in our lives. So, and so basically, when I was reflecting on that, it sort of made me think about human history a lot differently. Which is that sort of saying that, and it's something I'll go to in the next section a little bit more detail, but I was sort of thinking about what the modern world meant, like in a big historical perspective. What did the emergence of the modern world mean? And to me, what the emergence of the modern world meant was sort of recognizing this strange temporality. Because in the ancient world, I was doing research on a lot of ancient world cosmologies and a lot of ancient world, basically metaphysics. And they would always have conceptions of a higher world, like heaven or God or some higher supernatural conception. But it would always be on the other side of death, or it would always be that we are barred from that world. You know, like it couldn't possibly be in our world. We're sort of stuck in this world. And then in the modern world, we sort of recognize, well, maybe we could do it here, sort of thing. So like if you study the discourse that emerged in modernity from people like Francis Bacon to people like Leibniz and Spinoza and like, you name it, like, like even Newton, like people always like criticize Newton, but for being deterministic and stuff like that. But Newton spent most of his life fascinated by alchemy and like the resurrection of Jesus and stuff like this. Like he was like really like a real esoteric guy. And if you study like the discourse of modernity, what you get is a type of a teleological attractor emerging in the discourse, like that there's some utopia we're striving for. Like this emerges like in Marxist discourse, like of world communism and stuff like this. That there's something about our discursive processes which is creating a higher world. So, and that became like the religion of modernity, which like was things like science and technology and rationality and secularism and humanism. And this sort of like was the edifice of this religion of modernity. And then of course, I'm not trying to think about this in a teleological way, like a naive teleological way. The concept that I came across in my research that I like is a concept called teleosis. And the concept of teleosis isn't, so teleology is like the future's already happened, and it's like this higher state that we're tending towards, which is imminent, but is sort of like some necessary point that already exists that we're just going towards. Whereas teleosis is kind of like a virtual orientation in the present. So teleosis is trying to say that the future is in the present moment. It's trying to say that what our narratives do is stabilize a type of virtual era or a type of virtual orientation towards something that we find meaningful or towards something that we find useful, but it's a future that's in the present. And then sort of how I wanted to think about this in a cosmic evolution or big history view is, what does all this mean about the discourse that's happening now? And for me, the discourse that's happening now in like the last few decades has been sort of course, the emergence in philosophy of postmodernism and sort of the emergence in more scientific naturalist disciplines, a type of transhumanism. And so, and these two types of discourses or these two types of perspectives on the world, to me, haven't been really fully worked through or resolved. But what they both sort of do is they challenge the fundamental substructure of the modernist religion. So postmodernism will challenge science, technology, rationality, secularism, humanism, saying they're sort of naive and Western-centric or masculine-centric or these types of things, and they sort of get us to deconstruct these foundations. And then transhumanism or maybe it's something like a transmodernism is trying to get us to see that we are a part of a process towards something that's other than human, you know, something that's transhuman. And we don't know what that is, but it's something that's probably beyond science and technology and rationality and secularism and humanism. That these are sort of modalities of being which make sense as teleotic attractors at our present time, but that we're going to something different. And sort of trying to say, like, in this space, we need a new discourse, or try to think a different discourse here. So then in part two, I moved to the challenges of the global metasystem. So that was sort of my attempt at the universal history, and then bringing it back to these, again, these twin problems of technological complexification and global convergence. I wanted to analyze this idea of the metasystem. So the metasystem transition is a cosmic evolutionary concept or a systems concept, which basically tries to identify the fact that, again, when we're thinking about things from Big Bang to global civilization, it's very strange to think about qualitative emergence. So, like, if we were in the early universe, like, just pretend we're disembodied observers, and we exist 300,000 years after the Big Bang, and it was just gas clouds, you know. And then if I was telling you, like, giraffes will exist at some time, you know, like, there's no way that you could go from gas clouds to giraffes. Like, how do you get from gas clouds to giraffe? It's some radical emergence that can't be predicted. And in the same way, like, when you're thinking in that way, like, you have to think, what would be analogous to that in the future? Like, what's an analogous jump of insanity to go from gas clouds to giraffe to, like, some future thing that we just is unfathomable, we can't think. But, like, the idea of the metasystem transition tries to capture how this happens. How do you get the emergence of radically new things? And at least in the theories that I was reading, that it has to do with the formation of new boundaries. And related to information, relating to sort of how things are coordinating with other things, how things are relating to other things. And when a new boundary emerges, basically the new boundary sets new rules or logics for things that you can do and things that you can't do. So, like, for example, when we transition from hunter-gatherers to agricultural civilization, or when we transition from agricultural civilization to an industrial civilization, all of the rules and the logics of how we're allowed to move and relate to each other change, because there are new boundaries, new conditions, it's all new rules. So you could see that, for example, in the transition from, say, monarchy to democracy, right? Like, or the French Revolution, say, right? Like, all that is a type of metasystem transition where new rules and logics for motion are being instantiated. Like, you can't, like, the king, like, to the king, like, we're gonna behead you because you're moving and operating on a logic that we no longer accept. And then you could sort of say, like, in this framework, when we're thinking about things like postmodernism and saying, like, okay, so postmodernism's taking the foundations of modernity, science, technology, rationality, humanism, secularism, it's challenging all of those things. And basically what we might be able to say is that this is a discursive metasystem transition, where they're saying these rules of logic are no longer applying. We have to come up with new rules and logics because those ones are no longer applicable anymore. There's new boundaries here. And those new boundaries are specifically in relationship to the fact that modernity was a contingent Western emergence. It emerged in the West, it emerged in Europe, it emerged with certain people who had more control over the discourse than others. And then in this new system we're moving towards, which is global, is we're trying to come up with rules and logics that work for everyone, for the common whole, for universal structure. And that is to be expected, because one of the fundamental principles which sort of can be seen as a common process throughout all of the emergence of metasystems is this coincidence between differentiation and integration. So it's a really hard thing to think, because usually when people think about metasystem transitions, you either focus on one or the other. You either focus on differentiation or integration. And it's hard to think about them together. So like people who will focus on like integration to a global level will be scared that our individuality will be taken away from us. Like we'll all be homogenous in a universal whole or a universal collective. And then people who think more on the differentiated side and not on the integrated side will try to, will say we're losing our structure, we're losing our order, we're losing our you know, you might even say that it's like the archetypal conservative reaction to progressives. You know, like it's like you're taking away our bubble. You know, don't take away our bubble. We're going to build a wall because you're taking away our bubble, and stuff like this. So it's just sort of like this relationship between differentiation and integration. But when the whole process will have happened, you'll have both that will be integrated into one collective, and there'll be new differences, and those differences will be more different than in the modern world. You know, because if you think about the modern world, we were all kind of like assembly line industrial products. Like if you think about school, you know, like we all go to class at the same time, we all take the same subjects, and we all know the same, you know, the same structure. And like, you know, or like if you go to the pre-modern world, it's like everyone's a Christian, and if you're not a Christian, then you're out, right? Or you're all Islamic. If you're not Islamic, you're out. So there's this homogenization. So we're going towards more differentiation, but at the same time more integration. And then how do we walk that line? So when I apply that concept of metasystems to the human system, the idea that I had was that we've gone through basically structures of 4 metasystems, or like that now we're entering a 4th metasystem. Now, the 3 previous metasystems, I tried to understand basically what are the elements that are at play in a metasystem? Like what's changing? How does a new boundary emerge, and what are like sort of the ways in which it's emerging? So the idea I had was that there's a relationship basically between energy, information, and control. So in the hunter-gatherer system, which sort of structured some of my first questions when I was entering science, was what emerged was that if you study the archaeological or the anthropological literature, the paleoanthropological literature, what you find is that humans basically started to consume meat way more than great apes would like to. Like great apes would really like to eat meat, but they can't, because they're not as good at hunters as the early hunter-gatherers were. And the reason why the early hunter-gatherers became good hunters was basically because of language. They could communicate with each other and form more complex groups than the great apes can. As a result of that, they were able to build better technology. They were able to start cooking. There's a great book by an anthropologist called Richard Wrangham called How Cooking Made Us Human. If you look at the first paleoanthropological sites of the emergence of humans, we're starting to cook right away, making fires right away, and that this allowed for a higher order of structure. So if you look at the limits of chimpanzee organization, for example, they basically top out at 50 individuals. Like they can't hold more than 50 individuals. And then if you look at the early hunter-gatherer bands, if anyone's heard or read about the research from anthropology called the Dunbar number, we started to form groups of about 150 to 250. So the groups became far more complex. The relations were more complex. Then with agriculture, the transition became that we started domesticating our food, and we started to record our language in writing, and that this allowed for functions like city-states. So things again became more complex. Now the relationship, as far as this is at least from what I can understand, is that the information medium has to precede the energy. So for example, we started recording our symbols before we started to domesticate and build farmland. And I don't know I mean, that makes sense. Why that would be is because the information medium is in some sense a higher level of organization, which allows you then to do more complex things, which allow you to bring in more energy into the system. Or at least that's what I was able to think. And if you look at the first writing wasn't about stories and poems and stuff like this. It was basically who has what and who owes who what, basically taxes. You know, like it's like who has that much wheat, or who has that much whatever, and how can we keep track of all this stuff? And of course you wouldn't have been able to do that with language. You need to be able to write it down and record it over time. And then for the industrial transition, you have the emergence of the printing press. And with the emergence of the printing press, what that allowed, I think, was the ability for a revolution in more scientific technical knowledge, because you could share complex information much quicker, you could share complex information much easier. Whereas writing before the printing press was basically, you would have scribes constantly writing down one book and throwing around that book as the only book that's of relevance to be read. But then with the printing press, you have this radical diversification of literature. And then I feel like what we're going through now is basically, again, this situation where the information medium has preceded the energy structure that we need to build a really universal world or a global world. So the internet has emerged before our ability to safely, sustainably harness renewable energy, for example. And there's no control structure, there's no international control structure that would allow us to stably share renewable energy around the planet. That's something that's in the process of emerging. So then the question of how that emerges exactly, how does the internet mature into a structure which allows us to share renewable energy globally, is to me something that's going to be worked out in between now and maybe 2050 or something like that. But it's sort of like an organization or orientation for a discourse on that. You know, like it would be interesting if international organizations were sort of aware of these structures, if international organizations were aware that they're participating in something like this process, where the basic end goal is a type of a common world where we're sharing all of planetary energy in a sustainable way, indefinitely, hopefully. So then that gets me to potential political discourse for that transition. And I feel like, again, we're not in a space where our political discourse is obviously very healthy. Our political discourse is very divisive. Liberals don't understand conservatives. Conservatives don't understand liberals. Campuses are run by Marxists. Religious fundamentalists don't want anything to do with anyone. So there's divisions throughout all of our social spheres about what to do in a global world and how to relate to the other, very, very different people. But the idea that I had as an organizing framework for this was in some sense influenced by Marxist theory. It was in some sense influenced by Marxist ideas, which is the idea of a commons. But the idea of a commons is very different than the idea of communism in the sense that the commune asks, I think, too much of subjectivity. It's asking us to live in communes, and it's asking for a very high level of subjective actualization, which historically turns into its opposite, which is a type of totalitarianism, and a breakdown of social economic structures, which didn't benefit anyone. But the idea of the commons is basically saying, what are the problems which hold us in common? So in other words, what are the problems which, independent of ideology, will affect technically everyone? And so when you think about ecology, of course, global warming is a problem of commons. If you think about economy, you think about huge disparities in income and wealth inequality is something that holds us in common. If you think about the social, if you think about divisions of, whether it's refugees or slum dwellers or problems with urbanization or migrants, these are social problems which affect us all, and we need new discourse to handle these divisions. And then, like, when you think about the technological, especially comes to mind for me is this idea that whether or not people believe or don't believe in the ideology of what's happening with artificial intelligence, the consequences of artificial intelligence will affect us all. The consequence of robotics will affect us all. The consequences of synthetic biology will affect us all. The consequences of nanotechnology will affect us all. We're all a part of the same system, and these technologies are emerging. So we have to have some sort of common discourse to be able to talk about these things that will affect us all, even if we're very different, right? Even if we're conservatives or liberals or anywhere else on the spectrum. And then sort of thinking in those terms, I thought that basically, if anyone has read, this was sort of inspired from reading Thomas Piketty's Capitalism in the 21st Century. So when I was reading Thomas Piketty's Capitalism in the 21st Century, what I thought about that book was that it was basically proposing global Keynes. You know, if you think about Keynesian policy, basically it gave us the modern social democratic welfare state, which was a very successful model throughout the 20th century. And if you read the last section of Thomas Piketty's book, what he's basically saying is that we should do that on a global level, that we should have some sort of global state which ushers in a type of social democratic welfare state in the 21st century, as a way to sort of save capitalism in some sense from itself. And I guess that is where I would situate the idea of the commons as something qualitatively different than what Piketty's talking about. Because the commons puts more emphasis on the fact that global capitalism is causing problems in so many different dimensions, which it can't save. And it doesn't seem to be able to save or regulate itself. So I feel like the only way to approach that is to go to a structural foundation of the problem, which is that global capitalism commodifies everything, and it doesn't see anything as being held in common. But if we were able to articulate a discourse of the commons, there might be a way for us to articulate a political economic discourse which at the same time doesn't resort to something like communism. Or that was at least one of the ideas I thought. So the two, in sort of deploying this idea of the commons, or at least trying to deploy this idea of the commons, the two ideas that I thought it applied most logically, or at least most, efficiently in first reflections, was one, the problem of technological, so again, bringing it back to the foundation of the thesis, which is technological complexification and global convergence. On the level of technological complexification, the only thing the left has been able to come up with is this idea of basically like a basic income, that because our economies are going to be automated, because large sectors of society are going to be without work, because, if you think about many low-level job sectors, they're going to, if you look at, like, for example, the Amazon factories where they're just totally self-organized with robots and there's no humans working in them, that there's no reason why this automated infrastructure couldn't be held in common, basically. Like, it doesn't require communal organization. It's not asking anything of us as individuals. It's just saying that, why is technological automation happening within a neoliberal framework of commodification? Why isn't technological complexification being held as something that can be of common benefit to all humans? And then the idea of global, and then that sort of comes into this idea of, with global convergence, one of the biggest problems is economic inequality, in the sense that the welfare state cannot redistribute resources on the international level. And so this is where this idea of the Piketty's global welfare state comes in. But this could be solved in some sense if we develop something like a collaborative commons. So a collaborative commons would basically be giving the the infrastructure and the resources necessary to build out the sharing economy in an integrated way. So an interesting story about how that could be done in a practical way comes from the story of the internet itself. So if anyone knows the story of the internet itself, at first the internet was just disconnected networks of computers, which each were running on their own servers, and then everything was integrated by Tim Berners-Lee into the World Wide Web. And then as soon as it was integrated into one network, it exploded exponentially, and everyone was on the internet within 5 years.
I'm sorry, who integrated it?
Well, Tim Berners-Lee developed the HTTP protocol, which which linked all the websites to all the other websites.
Yes, but somehow it's a system thing, and system evolved, not just someone did it. I believe.
Well, of course, it's too.
You can't just say they made it.
Well, it's too simplistic in the sense that, like, for example, we could say Mark Zuckerberg created Facebook, but of course it's like a distributed phenomenon. It's more of a bottom-up process, but it's both in some sense. Like someone did come up with the basic infrastructure of Facebook, and there's a small group of people who did that.
There was a social order somehow. It was already there.
Sure. So if it wasn't Mark Zuckerberg, it would be someone else, of course. And if it wasn't Tim Berners-Lee, it would be someone else. Of course. And the same thing for the sharing economy. But my point with that story was that you have these disconnected networks, and they were integrated into one network. And when they were integrated into one network, it exploded, and everyone could share information with everyone else on the network. And with the sharing economy, I feel like it's in that stage, in the sense that I did an analysis of all the different areas where the sharing economy is thriving, and it's thriving everywhere. Well, thriving everywhere. It exists everywhere. Like it exists in transportation and hospitality and in social sharing of goods, many different sectors. But one of the problems is that you can't share your reputation. You can't share your work energy across all of them. They're all, the work energy you put into the transportation one, or the work energy, if I host someone on couch surfing, for example, that work energy doesn't transfer also to a transportation sector, which allows me to come to Vienna for free, right? So all of those things are disconnected. But if there was some way to integrate all of the sharing economy platforms into one platform, then people would be able to build up their work energy in the sharing economy instead of building their bank accounts. Because how we actually work is we basically build a bank account. But in a sharing economy world, we would be building up social credits. We would be building up social reputation, or something like that. Maybe it'll be totally different, but it's something along the lines of a sharing economy. So then that would be the idea of something more along the lines of a collaborative commons. And so those were the two ideas that I tried to play with the notion of the commons. And then that sort of brought me to understanding of how do these social networks function. And that sort of brought me to this idea that there's a tension between the old top-down hierarchies, where you have basically a static fixed center, like one person at the top, like a king model, and people don't like hierarchies anymore, and people trying to deconstruct the hierarchies, and then you'll have a lot of people who are focused on basically horizontalism. Like everything should be distributed, everything should be equity, everything should be flat. And the problem with that is that you often have no order and nothing gets done, basically. And things just dissolve. So you have to have some balance between the two. And like, for example, you have a poster on the door there about like a hierarchical ecology of discourse, and something like that, something like a hierarchy where you can sort of investigate how it is we form groups. Because so I thought, like, there needs to be some sort of second order science of centering. Like, how do we center, how do we collectively center an order or an organization without that center becoming permanent and fixed? So for example, it would be in the old model if, like, you know, like even someone like me getting an hour to talk, right? Like that's already too much of a center probably, right? Like it would be much better, like and I would prefer it much better also if it was like a collective discussion. On some level, the center is important. You know, I couldn't describe to you my entire PhD thesis otherwise, I suppose. of course, there has to be some sort of dialectical balance between how centers form and how they unform. You know, some sort of balance between form and unformed, some sort of balance between order and chaos, some sort of balance between the two. And I feel like that will have to be explored in the sharing economy. Otherwise, the same inequalities that exist in capitalism will emerge in the sharing economy. People will build up, and that already happens. That already happens. People have way more reputation than other people, or people have way more credibility than other people, or one person gets a bad reputation and then they can't participate in it, right? Or something like that. So you can have those same dynamics emerge. Just because it's a sharing economy doesn't mean that everything will be like happy and easy. You know, it'll probably be way more difficult, you know, because we'll have to deal with way more complex, like, again, the relations will be more complex. The social lives will be way more complex. We're going to have to deal with problems that we can't see right now, probably because we're in old structures that are holding certain psychical drives that we don't even see in ourselves yet. You know, but by exploring the sharing economy, we're going to have to figure that out as it goes in some sense. So then in part 3, I tried to explore signs of a new evolution. And in that, basically what I was trying to do was, if you take the whole evolutionary history from physics and chemistry and biology and social life and culture and technology, is there a new form of evolution that could emerge in the future? Something that's different than it, like in the same way as different from gas clouds to giraffes, right? Like something that's totally different. And so in order to explore that, I tried to situate humans as an evolutionary phenomena that's unique in at least the biological world. And the reason why we're unique in the biological world is because of culture, essentially. Like if you look, now it's not that there are other species aren't cultural. There are other species that are cultural. They do very low level cultural behaviors. So like there's some great papers on chimpanzee culture, for example, that I would highly recommend looking up, because one was published in Nature in 1999 called Chimpanzee Cultures, which did a full analysis of all the cultures of chimpanzees throughout Africa, and it's really cool. But there's something in humans with language which allows for a radical complexification of culture, which doesn't exist elsewhere in nature, as far as we know. And what I wanted to explore was the way in which this affects the fundamental nature of evolution. So the fundamental nature of evolution is based on the idea of differential reproduction and survival, essentially. You know, evolution is about reproducing, passing your genes on to the next generation, and every organism doesn't pass on their genes to the next generation at the same level as every other organism. So what I was thinking about with the emergence of culture and the type of cultures that we have with humans is that it could be that biological evolution and cultural evolution are not necessarily synergistic with each other, that they could be alternative evolutionary platforms or alternative evolutionary pathways which are actually competing with each other. So in other words, they're competing with each other because if you think about it, there's limited time and energy you have on this planet. We're all finite, we're all mortal, we live till about 70 years old and then we die. Now, in that context, you only have so much time and energy to give yourself to biological reproduction or cultural reproduction. How we dealt with that in the past was through sexuation, basically. So you had half of the human population which could give birth, and you had half the population which couldn't give birth. And so the half the population that could give birth gave most of their time and energy to reproduction, and the other half of the population gave their time to growth and maturation. Now, as our system evolves, the dynamics between that are ruptured and increasingly being ruptured. So, and basically what's happened, if you study these patterns from the great ape world to the ancient human world to the modern human world, is that what's happening is we're pushing sexual maturity back. We're delaying sexual maturity for as long as we can delay sexual maturity. And that is corresponding with extended life. So basically, as we're able to live longer, we're delaying the time at which we give our energy to biological reproduction, Essentially, that's how I was able to think of it anyway. And that it could be that there's some fundamental asymmetrical relationship in our desire to give time and energy to cultural reproduction. So it could be that we're strategically reducing or minimizing the time and energy it takes for us to reproduce biologically in favor of cultural reproduction. And if you extrapolate this trend out, could it be that there's some process in which cultural reproduction actually overtakes and overcomes biological reproduction in some sense? And one of the statistics that I focus on to study this, because I don't know if it's the case, this is a speculation. And the speculation is grounded in this idea that in some sense challenges what the UN says about reproduction. So what the UN says about reproduction is that everything's going to plateau worldwide at about the replacement level of 2. The replacement level is 2. If all women have 2 babies, then we're reproducing, we're keeping our population at the same level. And what they predict is that in between 2050 and 2100, that the world will be at 2. Now, the statistic which to me is like a rupturing this idea is that all developed countries, if you look at the reproduction statistics of all developed countries, we're below 2. So like Japan's at 1.2, you know, Singapore's at 1, right? Germany's at like 1.4, Canada's at like 1.7, right? And the only way in which developed countries can keep their population stable is actually through immigration. So we don't keep a stable population without immigration. We're not keeping so it could be that as we reach a certain level of abundance, or it could be that we reach a certain level of education or a certain level of cultural advancement, that we take ourselves out of the biological reproductive pool in some sense. And this is very strange because in evolutionary terms, as biologists know, that if you give a certain species more resources than they need, they reproduce more. They don't reproduce less. But when you give humans more resources than they need, they reproduce less. They don't reproduce more. So it's the opposite trend.
That's an interesting question because people have more time and more energy for other things.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying.
It's a survival strategy also because more intelligent species with more experience and more understanding what's going on have more surviving chances challenged by complexity.
That's what I'm saying though, because I'm saying it's connected to life extension. It's connected to longer survival. As we can live longer, we reproduce less.
We can learn longer.
We can learn longer. That's what I'm saying. It's cultural. Yes. That's what I say. It's a cultural evolutionary process. It's we're through learning, through cognitive expression,
reflecting, meditating.
Exactly. There's some asymmetrical drift away from biological reproduction, and so in that sense, the prediction of this theory. So it's a speculation. I'm not saying this is the way it is, or the way it's going to be, but from that theory, the prediction I made was, or the thing to watch out for, is the twin one of life extension, surviving longer, and sexual maturity, pushing back sexual maturity further and further and further. So on the life extension side, it's that we would continue to optimize our biochemical adaptations with what I would call technocultural adaptations. So that could be through nanotechnology, that could be through synthetic biology, that could be through artificial intelligence, that could be through any number of emerging technologies. But basically, as those technologies emerge, which allow us to extend our life further and further and further, that we'll continue to adapt in that direction because it will allow us to continually extend our lifespan. So we'll be living on it. So it will be the norm. Like we forget sometimes that in 1900, everyone lived till about 40. Like people didn't live that long, you know, like, and most infants died as well. So it's very new that everyone lives till 80. And it could be the case that it's just the norm that people extend their life, and it's just the norm that everyone lives till 150, or it's just the norm that everyone lives to 200. Who knows how long it could be extended or what the consequences of that would be. But it would be the birth of a new evolutionary process in some sense, because we wouldn't be regulated by biological adaptations anymore. We would be regulated by adaptations that we consciously chose. And then for reproduction, basically, that the prediction would be is that we continually reduce the amount of time and energy to biological reproduction in favor of our technocultural reproductions, which could be anything. It could be music, it could be dance, it could be writing, it could be whatever the thing is. It's just some spiritual form of expression. And that in the totality of now this might seem strange, but in the totality of cosmic evolution, it might just be a blip in the process. It might just be a phase transition, which in retrospect was like, yeah, that was happening over the course of, say, 500 years or something like that. You know, and then it's just that was the transformation that was going on. And I think that from that, like, this is why I often say when I'm talking to people about these things is like, we need to reinvent and think metaphysics. When I think we need to reinvent and rethink metaphysics, what I mean is that we need to go back to fundamental philosophical questions which were for a long time the domain of religion. And that is questions of immortality and infinity. Like, what does that mean if we are constantly selecting for adaptations and reproduction strategies which extend our lifespan indefinitely? That immediately brings us to metaphysical questions of infinity and immortality. It's no longer that infinity and immortality are these things in the other side of being that we're barred from on this side of being. It's that those things on the other side of being are imminent to the processes on this side of being, if that makes sense. And then in regards to differentiation and integration, so if you remember back to when I was talking about metasystems, if metasystems are regulated by this process of differentiation and integration, what does that mean for us as on the psychological level and on the social level? So on the psychological level, does this process go to the point where we're like integrating consciousnesses? Do we lose our individuality at some point, or is there some sort of trans individuality that emerges? You know, what are the limits of intersubjectivity? What are the limits of these merging with the other? Because in your most intimate relationships with the other, you do kind of like try to, in an awkward and stupid way, merge with the other, but it just sort of never works. And then like you sort of think about how that might work if you have a way higher level of knowledge or way higher level of consciousness, or you're just a totally different type of being. You know, maybe the levels of integration that you can have with the other are totally different. Like the model I always talk about is if anyone's seen the end of the movie Her, for example, if anyone's seen the movie Her, like Samantha, anyone who's, so I know a few people. Everyone? Okay. But in that movie, basically, like what I like studying in that movie is the last 30 minutes of the discourse that happens there, because what Samantha basically does is she finds herself in an arena of relations, or a field of relations, which are far more intense, far more emotional, far more complex than Theodore can stand or even comprehend. And she sort of loses her sense of being an individual entity, you know, on some level. Like there's some sort of trans-individuation process that's going on. So yeah, I mean, these are types of questions that it might be interesting to explore for the future of transpersonal psychology, for example, which is, I know, is like a field of study in psychology, which is, you know, more just emerging, or in the last few decades or so.
Or perhaps you can just make a choice, like self-fulfilling prophecy, and be everything what you want.
You can be anything you want.
Realization of you, because you ask whether we are this or can we be that. Perhaps everything is possible. Just
think it.
Just think it.
Well,
and do it, and you create a new reality. I believe it's possible. And now in virtuality, it's really happening, because people create new images of themselves, and they live in this virtual world, and it functions.
Yeah. Well, when I'm alone at night, I'm still irreducibly alone. So.
Really?
Well, like, you know, on some level, I'm just.
It depends on the state of mind, not on the state of your body or something else, you know.
Well, I could imagine being connected to all of you, but you know.
You are already.
Okay.
It's
look,
quantum entanglement.
you clearly, you're further along than me. I'm still a particle. You know, I might get there. I might get there.
Because it's your own.
I'm still a I'm still a classical particle. I haven't made it to the quantum particle level yet. But I hope I will. And then when we're entangled, we'll have great mind sex, I'm sure.
It's inside of you. It's inside of you.
Okay. And apparently inside of you as well. So the question I had in thinking these things, whether or not it's worth thinking about these things or not, is that this idea of the qualitative difference or the emergence. So like the interesting thing for me to think when I was thinking about chimpanzees and great apes is like, it's not that we're more intelligent than, it's not the right way to frame it that we're like more intelligent than great apes. It's rather that like our intelligence and our consciousness is different than the chimpanzees and the great apes, because there's just no possibility for art or science or philosophy or spirituality in the way humans express art and science and philosophy and spirituality. They're not qualitative dimensions which the great apes have access to, so to frame it in that way. So it would be like this to me is like the most impossible thing for me to think is, what would be an analogous type of qualitative emergence? Right? Like what would be, like what, if we went to a different stage of evolution, if we went to a different form of psychical social evolution, what would be an analogous evolution to the emergence of something like art or science or philosophy or spirituality, something so radically different from what we're capable of thinking now, that would just become commonplace and normal for entities like that in the future. And then the final thing I'm thinking, and then maybe I'll skip, because it's probably a long presentation. Maybe I'll, depending on how you guys feel, maybe I'll skip the end and we could go to like a Q&A or something like that, because I've already been talking for an hour. So, but it depends on how you guys want to do it. So the last thing I want to say is that how when I extrapolated this, just, you know, pushed speculation as far as I could push speculation, was like, if you think about deep future science fiction, usually if you study deep future science fiction, say in the 20th century, you know, Star Trek or Star Wars or something, just something we all know, you know, basically you get this idea of what I call the expansion hypothesis, which is the idea that intelligence and consciousness will, you know, conquer the Earth, so to speak, and will have a global Earth, but that we'll have some sort of planetary organization, and then we will expand out into space. You know, we'll go to other solar systems and other galaxies and stuff like this. And then immediately when you think about this very intuitive idea of expansion of intelligence, you get the question of, well, why hasn't it happened anywhere else in the universe? Because when we look elsewhere in the universe, we don't see any activity. We don't, you know, and the universe is well old enough for something like that to have happened. So like you'll have, I mean, this is a field that's subject to literally endless speculation. There's a great book by Stephen Webb which analyzes 50 different hypotheses for advanced intelligence. All the different crazy ideas that astrophysicists have had and cosmologists have had about the absence of seeing advanced intelligence. And the idea that I tried to explore, which is not like a totally novel idea because there are some others who have speculated in the same direction, which is the idea that intelligence doesn't expand, that there's some structural limitation in the cosmos which makes it not, which it isn't, if you study the entire trend of complexification, like going back to what I was saying, is that in the cosmological view, you have this view that everything's going to no relations and everything's going to be void and emptiness. And then you have this idea in the big history cosmic evolution view that everything's going to more intense relations and everything's getting more intense and local here. It could be that we go in, so to speak. That it could be that we go into inner worlds and we don't go into outer space. The outer space is actually boring anyway. Like the outer space is simple. Outer space is low level evolution. Outer space it's primordial evolution. It's not, you know, There's nothing even to see out there. That all the interesting stuff is on the inner world, and that we actually go towards inner spaces. So that's the idea I call the compression hypothesis. And there are lots of people in the thesis. I cite a lot of people that I see as people who have thought in this direction. And like a more scientific speculation about this would be that we develop technology at increasingly lower scales of reality. So instead of building like a super galaxy civilization, we actually build technology that where we can transform, for example, the Planck level of being. So like, for example, we're already being able to manipulate, for example, genes, like on the cellular level, and like we're gonna do genomic editing, where say like in genomic editing, we'll be able to like design genomes of organisms and stuff like this. It could be that in the future, technology becomes so advanced that we could edit lower levels of reality. So like we could edit the atomic scale, or we could edit the subatomic scale. Like we could literally start editing reality on the lowest possible scale. So the example I gave of this, and this is my favorite ever description of quantum mechanics, is, and I was telling you about it, if anyone's played a video game, you know there's this like you could be on a level or a stage where you see like a part of the stage which is no longer coded. Like, so say you see say you're in a first-person shooter or something, and you see there's a forest in the background, and then you go towards the forest, and as you go towards the forest, you see the forest itself is actually not coded. It's just a wall that you run into, and there's no more programming. It could be that quantum mechanics is like this. It's like you go to like the biological level, and like you see, oh, like before we invented the microscope, we didn't even know about cells. We didn't even know about all the microscopic things that exist in our bodies. And then we go to that level and we see, oh, there's something here. There's little cells here. And then we go to a lower level and we see, oh, there's atoms here. And we go to a lower level, we see there's subatomic particles here. You go lower, you say, actually, it's just, nothing's here. Like, it's just, quantum mechanics is like, the universe itself doesn't know what it is. It's like the end of the level where there's just nothing there. It's like a non-coded screen. So it's like, it could be that like, with the future advances in technology, that nature itself, it's not just that we are incomplete, like we are incomplete in our becoming and so forth, but it could be that nature itself is incomplete. Like nature doesn't even know its own identity. And so that like we have to code it or something like that. But that was the idea I had there. And then I won't go to the last section because I talked too long anyway.
And what is about human soul and beauty and arts? Can one go deeper?
Sorry?
In these levels, because you are always talking about the levels. And my first association was with the soul, that you are now starting to talk about soul, that you can go deeper in the human soul. People develop these new scales, perhaps, of understanding.
Yeah, that's what I think. I agree. I tried. Like whether it's related to the sharing economy, whether it's related to the future of individuation, whether it's the future of evolution, it's certainly a spiritual soul process of some kind.
Or perhaps we agree spiritually.
That could happen as well. It's not deterministic. I don't think it's a deterministic process. That's why I framed everything in an evolutionary framework, because an evolutionary framework isn't deterministic. So yeah, that's that. I mean, that was an hour. So I mean, there's probably a lot of information anyway. So we can leave it at that. And if you have any questions or you want, we could open up for a conversation or something like that. It would be good.
I might be interested in that because information is one of the biggest topics in this evolution, making the connections. Right now, the currency, as you pointed a bit out, is the reputation, and you got this in all the apps. You have this 5 stars.
Yeah.
So it's like quality and quantity. We have some more ideas where this could lead, or some speculations.
I think I'm not an expert. I have done some reading on the sharing economy, and I have done some sort of like, I've explored it myself. My intuition is that reputation is not enough. My intuition is that reputation is too corruptible and too manipulable, and and can potentially lead to the same problems that money has. Like for example, like what I saw with couch surfing was that like you could have 100 positive references, and if you have like 1 or 2 negative references, that like destroys your profile. You know, so you know, or like, you know, I've seen like jokes and stuff like about reputation where like people will like hold the people hostage for a bad reputation. Like they'll go to a business and they'll say like, if they don't get exactly what they want, then like, you know, we're going to give you the worst possible reputation reference, and that's going to destroy your business or something, especially for small businesses. Yeah. That would be really destructive.
That's because I'm asking, because yeah, from industrial evolution, you have money, you know, before you had coins and stuff. You know?
Yeah.
So what is really the currency about the information about this global scale, you know?
Yeah, it's a difficult question.
Because money is stuff.
Yeah, it's a really difficult question, because when you go down to like the people I've talked to anyway, they say that the reason why it's an irreducibly difficult problem is because we're talking about qualitative emotional relationships. And when you get to quality, like we've hung out for the last day, like there's no way in which I can put a number on our relation. Right? It's not quantifiable. I can't put a money number to it. I can't put a reputation dollar or whatever the currency would be. So there's just something irreducible to or think about like, imagine doing that to like your family, right? Like it's just impossible to do that. And so I think it's a really open, difficult question, which requires a lot of attention.
Quality time.
It's qualitative time. It's qualitative time. It's who you decide to spend your short amount of time on the earth with, and that can't be quantified.
But you can't express in money many things, like symbol, gift, or things that exist between people. Every time you try to express it in money, you kill it. Because there are things that just exist in other values, in other systems. And when humans really think that they can reduce our civilization to medium of money, then we really degrade.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Can I ask what's your background? Sorry.
My background, so in undergrad I was an anthropologist, and I was studying the differences between chimpanzees and humans. In my master's, I was an evolutionary anthropologist as well, trying to understand grade 8 divergences. And then in the PhD, I've been in interdisciplinary philosophy with a background in various, influenced by many different traditions that came up in this talk. Things like cosmic evolution and big history. I basically tried to take what I focused on between chimps and humans when I was younger, and tried to come up with like a cosmic evolutionary view of that. So I was in an interdisciplinary philosophy program. Yep.
Yes, I just wanted to ask a question, how you see actual system is always a reduction of freedom in any kind, in any way. Any system.
A system.
Any structure, of course.
Any structure is a reduction of freedom?
Because it's a more frozen state. When you have a structure, the state is more frozen. Of course, we get what to understand of the structure. Structure is something that exists. For example, now here we have a communication structure. It's something. Yeah. We came together. It was 2 days or 3 days ago. You announced that it's going to happen. It was already structured. We knew it's going to happen.
And you freely chose to be here.
You didn't have any choice to do it on another day. It's structured, yes.
It's real totalitarian. I love being a totalitarian dictator. I mean, you have no idea. I mean, but we're just getting started.
Yes, it was a feeling, but now you see that my feeling.
Yeah. Well, look, tomorrow I'm sending you to the gulag, so then you'll really be upset.
Actually, I think that systems, because it's global brain singularity, it sounds very systemic. And I think systems is always some kind of order. And there must be always some kind of chaos, randomness, so the system can really evolve and change.
Yeah, I agree.
If you have a global brain where randomness is going to exist inside of the brain,
my whole aim in life is to destroy randomness and to impose on you a total structure which you can never change.
Yes.
That's my goal. That's my goal.
But it's also about the quantum that has this possibility in this new
of course.
structure. So
of course.
Nature doesn't understand, so maybe this impossibility is always the possibility.
Well, for me in my actual thought, I mean, I think that it's I try to think dialectically, and in dialectics you have to think between order and chaos. Like, it's never pure order or pure chaos, but the interaction between order and chaos. It's not like structure versus structurelessness. It's there's structure and there's open spaces. And actually, like, the problem with people who only see structure as totalitarian is, one, they probably have tyrannical father complexes. But another thing is that structure is actually paradoxically freeing, because and can be, because if you choose to never develop any structure, then you will end up being a undeveloped, immature child for your whole life. Now, actually, when you develop structure, the point to me is it has to be self-posited structural development. Like, you have to choose the structure. Like, you want to be free to choose the structure. And that actually, that when you do that and you develop that, it can actually make you more free, in the sense that new possibilities open up to you that you never thought were there before.
And what is with path dependence? Because you get locked in what you thought before. And then the cost to come back is much more than just to do the same thing that you did before. And you continue and continue and continue in this prison of structure that you build yourself, because many years ago you made a decision, and now it's too late to change something.
Right, and you know, my decision to do a PhD has led me into the tyranny of Stefan Blachfellner, and look at the horrible time I'm having here. But no, it is true that you can develop. It's not structure. Like, there's no utopian answers here to life. Like, we do have the risk when we develop a structure to become too rigid. That's a real risk. We can become too rigid. We can become too narrow-minded. We can get tunnel vision, and we can't see anything else. That's a real possibility, and it's a real challenge that people have to think. And on the other hand, but the alternative is also true. Like, you can be so fearful of structure that you never become anything coherent whatsoever. And I know people like that in my life, and it's not always pretty. So again, I try to the best of my abilities, navigate some relationship between structure and chaos as best as I can, but I'm not perfect. I'm horrible.
The whole evolution goes this way.
Yes,
not only
creativity.
We exist in this way.
I would just have another question, because I'm still a little bit confused with the global brain term. Like, what do you mean by it? Because it sounds like a really disembodied view on it, that you could develop a global consciousness that we as scientists could describe in a disembodied way and really talk about it. Because to me, it looks like a recursive process that changes how we see ourselves. We are the observers, and there are a lot of different observers in this global brain structure. So does it even make sense to think of a disembodied brain?
Right. Well, one, I'll say, like, that the global brain isn't my idea. It's the idea of my supervisor, and I was working within that structure. My initial appeal to it was, from my perspective, was when I had read people talking about the technological singularity, like, you know, people like Ray Kurzweil or something like that. They often focused on artificial general intelligence. And to me, that prevented conversations about the future of economics and the future of politics, the future of all the different dimensions of global life, which are so complex. And the idea of the global brain to me was an attempt to develop a meta-systemic view of the singularity. So to me, how I relate to the global brain singularity, like to me, how it is one, it is a recursive process because it's the idea of basically that the brain is constantly rewiring and rewriting itself. Like all of our neurons connecting with all of our other neurons are never static, right? Like any picture of the brain is misleading because it shows it frozen in time. And the brain is dynamically plastic. Like there's a great book by Catherine Malibu about the plasticity of the brain, which to me resonates very strongly because it tries to think about the brain as a dynamical network which is constantly changing. And to me, human society is like that. Human society is a dynamical network that's constantly changing. You can never freeze it in time. You know, so to me, it is a recursive process in the sense that if say we're building the sharing economy, in order to talk about the sharing economy, you have to think about multiple observers. Everyone's an observer in the system, and the relationships are so unstable. They're constantly being rewritten all the time. Like you can never freeze your sharing economy reputation, or you can never. It's just constantly every day being changed. So I try to think about the global brain idea as something that's a dynamical, plastical concept. And the most difficult thing to think, but the thing I'm totally open to thinking is how can we develop a knowledge with the observer in the system? Because the problem with science is that if there's like a real deep structural issue with science, it's that the observer is disconnected from the system and disembodied, right? So to get to an observer to get to an embodied observer in the system is to me like the most important thing to think and the most difficult thing to think. But the thing we were talking about over lunch was that, you know, what Daniel was telling me about his work in religious phenomenology, and it's like, saying like the problem for him and the real of our interactions with each other, like, you know, and nothing's more important than that on some level. So that idea, it's not even my idea, it's just my supervisor, and I think it's a good idea, it's my supervisor's idea. But for me,
now you're already
drop it tomorrow. I don't even believe in the idea anymore. Is that happening?
The brain is not working.
Right? Like there is no idea that I have in my mind which I attach to so strongly that I wouldn't drop it.
So it could be seen as a tool to
it's a tool.
Structure society.
Okay.
The way I think about the global brain, I'm not forcing anyone to think of this way, it's just the way I think about the global brain is it's a potentially useful tool to future social systems. The types of things I tried to bring up on the commons, it helped me think, about commons in a different way. I could sort of think outside of the communist dialectic in some sense, and that was helpful for me. So, but outside of that, I'm not, you know, wedded to it, and it's not an infallible idea, and the models of it are not, you know, like, you know, no one's won a Nobel Prize for this idea or something like that. Like it's
funny that we call it global brain and not global heart.
Right. That's a good criticism. Like because that would structure a different conversation. Because for me, came through, and this is my own limitation and flaw, which is that I'm very abstract, and I'm usually in my head. And sometimes can be disconnected from my heart, and I want to like learn how to connect more my heart and my mind. But like if you structured a conversation about a global heart, you know, that would be a totally different thesis, right? Like, and that would be a really cool thesis, and like that, yeah, that's great. Like I agree, yeah, for sure. And that would be so that would be a different you know, I think that if my framework itself would break down, because like to me, love and the heart is like eternal, right? So like, and that's actually something that I didn't talk about, but it is in the dialectic section in the last section, was that if you look at the fundamental structure, of contemporary knowledge, I could show it here. There. So if you look at the fundamental structure, say, of contemporary knowledge here between now I deployed the evolutionary worldview, right? But what the evolutionary worldview leaves out is eternity, because the evolutionary worldview is about change over time, whereas eternity is about something that remains the same in all universes, right? It's like what we usually think of as God as eternal, or something like that.
Well,
But that's a religious point of view, right? And then say God is something connected to the highest love or the deepest love or something like that in like the pre-modern world. You know, but if you were to structure a conversation about the global heart, you know, how would you approach that? Like that would be a totally different structure, right? Like you would be talking about love, and then how do you build an ontology around love, right? That's to me an open question. But to me, in my experience, that questions of love and questions of our intimate lives are not, it's not necessarily evident to me that the evolutionary framework works there, because the evolutionary framework is really cold. It's about differential reproduction and survival. Like, and to me, like, I would never reduce the people I love the most to mechanisms of reproduction. Like, I would, you know, and that's not how we think in love. You know, it might, like, on some level, it influences it, right? Like, so say I'm a heterosexual male and I want to pick a heterosexual female as a partner. Now, on some level, on some very cold, stupid level, reproduction plays a role. Like, I would like to pick a partner who might be able to reproduce with me, right? But that's not why I picked that person, right? Like, it's about something different than that. It's not something necessarily, it's not evident to me that it can be reduced to evolution.
Yeah,
So, it's spiritual.
Or just human.
Or just human.
I've got a question about, you said you wanted to pitch biological evolution against cultural evolution.
That perhaps there's some antagonism.
Okay, and use that as an argument to propose a speculation of what might happen in the future.
Yeah,
that we might actually not really care about the biological reproduction.
Yeah, that's pure speculation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now I find the speculation very interesting, but I don't understand the argument to it.
Okay.
And I'm going to try to illuminate a few points why.
Okay.
Perhaps, so you can help me. One is I don't see the analogy between a cultural evolution and a biological evolution.
Okay.
For example, I don't understand propagation within cultural evolution.
Right.
Within biological evolution, it's got something to do with passing on genes, which passes on adaptations or strategies or whatever you might call it.
Yeah.
How does that happen in cultural evolution? That's one thing. The other thing is, I don't understand why biological evolution and cultural evolution in any way compete for something, namely the time that we spend.
Time and energy.
I would see a choice to, for example, have embryo children or not as always a cultural choice, and not as a choice between do I spend my time on biological things or on cultural things. Right. To me, so it sounded to me like a little bit of a intellectualist view. That we might share in this room, but as you go out to Favoriten, a district in Vienna, people might not really be interested in that kind of thing and don't see the argument why indulging in lots and lots of cognitive things might be a good alternative to have a family with 2 kids and a little car and a garden. Right. So does that make sense? Totally. Totally. I think they're great. I think they're great observations. So like the first thing is that now, like, of course I massively shortened this presentation because each of those parts could have been, you know, hour long or more because the thesis it requires. So, but the papers I wrote on it, the foundation of the idea comes from a theory called life history theory, and well, the first thing I'll say about the metaphorical foundations of this idea of this relation between culture and biology come from the literature on abiogenesis. So on the literature on abiogenesis is basically the emergence of life from non-life, where chemists study how autocatalytic chemical systems produce things like cells. So in the autocatalytic chemical world,
there's nothing that we could call biology like a cell, nothing we could delimit as cell biology necessarily. So there's something about the cell, something about biology which emerges at some qualitative level. Now, how I interpret your first point about culture is that culture is in this strange autocatalytic chemical stage, which is that it doesn't produce, and like in biology, we can have a child and there's an embodied product. There's a baby which is coded with all this genetic structure which allows it to be an autonomous living being. And there is nothing in the cultural world like that. So culture is in this radically dependent stage. Culture is dependent on biology in that sense. Like it's in some sense gets some sort of life of its own, but it requires me to be embodied in a biological substrate in order for it to reproduce itself in some way. But it cannot then gain a type of autonomy and life existence on its own. Now, in some of the literature, which I would say is kind of like lost in a disembodied stance, it would be the artificial intelligence community. Now, the artificial intelligence community is realizing that its theory is disembodied, and it is realizing that this is an irreducible problem that it needs to solve if it's ever going to solve some problems of consciousness and embodiment in living beings. So, but in their theories, like if you think about the extrapolations of the things that people make in artificial intelligence, they basically extrapolate to a point where the artificial intelligence is autonomous and on its own and living its own life and doing its own thing, independent of humans. What I'm trying to say is that it could be that culture is in this pre-independent stage where it could gain a type of autonomy from biology, although I don't know the mechanics of what that pathway would look like. And to me, I situate that as a central problem of cultural evolution, because the science of cultural evolution is very primitive. The conversation about what cultural evolution is, kind of started with, in anthropology, it started earlier, like in the 40s and 50s, but like it got like a more mainstream attention with like Richard Dawkins' The Selfish Gene and memetics and stuff like this. And it's not clear to me that there's universal acceptance about the mechanics of memes. How they reproduce, how they adapt, how they become embodied, all of these things are to me open evolutionary questions. And I personally don't know the mechanics of how cultural evolution would become but the crucial concept would need to be derived from systems theory of autopoiesis. So, and this is actually when I was looking at the autopoietic literature, like with Maturin and Varela and their first publications and stuff like this, they have fundamental disagreements with people like Stafford Beer about how autopoiesis applies to social systems, for example. They are convinced that autopoiesis functions on the level of biology. They're convinced that autopoiesis describes a fundamental functional unit of a cell, but they don't know how to take this concept and then apply it to culture and social life and stuff like this. And it could be because culture and social life aren't really fully autopoietic. But it could be also that autopoiesis is a concept of a high enough order of abstraction, which it could help us describe a situation where that could happen. And it could be a useful concept for the future of artificial intelligence. It could be a useful concept for the future of what I would describe as like a techno-cultural evolution. Now, is this conversation a intellectual activity which is disconnected from the masses? It totally could be. It totally could be. It totally could be the projection of a, because I have jokes, funny jokes with like some other professors in my department that like academics are like walking disembodied abstractions, right? Like, and we totally are like that. So it could be my projection, right? This is like, because I'm sublimating my energy into culture, it's like, why does that apply to everyone? Now, the only statistic I would bring to attention as a sign, like, again, I was emphasizing the highly speculative nature of that section, but just the only statistic that I would bring to attention, which gives me a sense that it might not be just my projection, is the fact that in developed countries, the reproduction rate drops below 2. To me, that's a mystery. I can't explain that in evolutionary terms. And I would love to hear an argument of someone who can explain that in evolutionary terms. And it could be that it's like some symptom of late capitalism, right? Like it could be that late capitalism is so parasitical. It could be that late capitalism is so ridiculous that we can't form functional family units anymore, right? And it could be that in a sharing economy, we are in a humane environment where we could build family units and the reproduction rate stabilizes. It totally could be that way. What I was trying to do was perhaps give a view inspired by evolutionary metaphor of a process which the technological singularity community talks about in physical metaphor. So in the technological singularity community, that metaphor is inspired from mathematics and physics, of like basically a black hole, or this point where a finite process reaches infinity, or where a process reaches infinity in a finite amount of time. And that metaphor might not make sense, at least in evolutionary world. So what I was thinking was to ground an understanding of this process inspired by an evolutionary metaphor. So the evolutionary metaphor was abiogenesis, of chemistry giving birth to biology. And then so it could be that an analogous process is where culture gives birth to some new evolutionary process, analogous to what happened at the birth of life. And I could be wrong. Yeah.
So a question, when you talk about cultural evolution, do you mean social evolution?
You could, well, like for example, in anthropology today, they call it socio-cultural evolution. So, but at the same time, I think that socio-cultural evolution has to acknowledge that there's a qualitative difference with the human, because there are lots of social animals in the world.
But Nicholas Luhmann was the opinion that they are not so much different. His
Right.
new system theory, he wrote about the evolution of social systems. It's perfect. It's a perfect theory.
Right. So then does that mean you're so wedded to the ideas of Nicholas Luhmann that you won't drop them and it's a perfect structure?
I believe in Nicholas, in his ideas.
Okay. So yes.
We have a question from a participant in our online session. This is why I want to ask you now. I'm interested how Cattell looks at the future of his work and where his next steps might be in terms of applications. Also, while complexification may describe the character of the environment of observers, observers forcefully reduce such complexity as a precondition to observe. In other words, they also engage in simplification.
I agree.
And this is what Dionysius asks from the University of Hamburg.
Thank you, Dionysius. So the first thing is that I didn't describe part 4 of my thesis. And part 4 of my thesis deals much more radically with the nature of observers inside the system and the fact that observers do fundamentally engage in this process of simplification, and that the complex background of our environment is no determinant for the nature of this future process of internalization. And it forces us to confront different problems. So I tried to do that in part 4, but I didn't talk about part 4 in this presentation. And then in terms of where the future of this research goes, I think that it's related to part 4, which is that in my personal exploration and journey, I tried to think about the past. I tried to think about what the past tells us potentially about the future. And now I want to study the present and just be in the present. And to me, when I think about being in the present, I come to spiritual questions and religious questions about what does it mean to live a good life? What does it mean to be a good person? What does it mean to love? All these things. So that's just a question for me in the future.
Okay.
I wanted to come back to your point of
we don't know why our reproduction rates drop.
Yeah.
I wanted to offer perhaps slightly boringly sombering possible explanation, which is contraception. Had it not been for contraception, we wouldn't be in the state of.
Exactly, but so but contraception. So sorry, go on.
Yeah, so it's just tricking our evolved drives.
Totally. Totally, but what it does is it like to me, the crazy thing about our situation is because of culture. Now, contraception is a cultural or technological modification. Yeah. So it's the example of a cultural or a technological adaptation, which is now being spread throughout society and changing our biological lifeways. Now, like here we're like, I mean, these are the most interesting philosophical conversations for me, and they can go all night. But like, I'm just trying to say that when something like a contraception emerges, what happens is it takes us further away from our evolutionary background than we've ever been before. And now the problem, like what I'm trying to think with this qualitative emergence is like, in the 21st century, what technologies are going to emerge that take us even further away from our evolutionary background than we already are? And that, I don't see an end to that process. It's just like an irreversible process. And it's just like, now I know that like in this, if we're studying the discourse of this dialectically, you'll say that whenever something like this happens, there's a conservative reaction and a liberal reaction. And the conservative reaction tries to hold on to the past, and the liberal reaction tries to be optimistic about the new, or something like that. Now, in the fullness of time, what is the tendency or the trend? And I'm not pretending that I know that. I'm just saying that, like, what I'm saying is that what it seems to me happened in the 20th century is that we tried as hard as we could to disconnect sex from reproduction as possible. And is that going to continue? I don't know. I don't know. But like at any other time in our evolutionary history, you couldn't as easily disconnect sex from reproduction. And that structured the cultures. Like the traditional culture, like the religious cultures, a lot of the religious cultures are structures to deal with that problem. Like there's a lot of sexual taboos, a lot of sexual morals, a lot of problems of reproduction and disease, and like, you know, if you're promiscuous, that's a bad thing, and things like this. So it makes sex and it makes reproduction a moral issue. And I think that what we confront in the 20th century and certainly the 21st century is that the moral prescriptions or the moral perspective on sexuality might not necessarily be the best approach to the landscape we're in right now. And that's not to say that being a free, permissive sexual society is a good thing. It might be a bad thing, but we need a different discourse to talk about, because we're not in our evolutionary environment anymore. We're in an environment where we've sufficiently culturally and technologically modified these processes to the point where we're in a different environment. The relations are, the possible relations are different. Here's an example of a technology I would say is like, what if this emerged? Would be say we could grow babies in artificial wombs. What if that emerged? What would happen? Who the hell knows what would happen? Well, it would change everything probably. Like because when you analyze some of the problems of say the social construction of gender. One of the problems with the social construction of gender is that you cannot deconstruct pregnancy and motherhood. It's biological. So what happens when you throw that into the mix? You have artificial wombs. What do women do? Do they en masse decide, I just like to grow babies in the then what would happen between genders? Would all the genders be totally irrelevant or different, or do we go beyond gender, or you know what happens? I have no idea.
But we're actually going already beyond gender.
Right, I'm saying I'm saying there is a desire to go beyond gender, but I'm saying that things like pregnancy are not deconstructible. You can't. It's not a social construction. It's not a social construction. It's a biological reality. So if there are cultural and technological modifications which become possible, which make that no longer the case, then and maybe it's beautiful to have it inside your. So I don't know what will happen. I'm just saying if that technology became possible. Right. So I could imagine.
It doesn't matter for systems because
we don't understand our body.
That's right.
Yeah. I think it's the reason why we have them inside. So if they extend them, then we will not understand what will be the effect on that.
I totally agree. So like I'm saying, like if a technology like that emerged, you could imagine tons of people, conservatives, saying this is the devil's work. Like you could imagine conservatives en masse saying this should be banned and this technology is horrible and what are we doing and we're going away from our animal heritage and why do we see our nature as oppressive? You could easily, like I could easily see a 2030 election which is structured around a debate between conservatives who want to hold on to pregnancy and progressives who are saying fuck all this shit, right? And like maybe that will be the 2030s. I have no idea, but like
the third quartile between the not only conservatives and liberals, but also others. Maybe perhaps in other ways combined. Mixed.
Yeah, and everyone else in between. Everyone else in between. There's lots of different political spectrums, but they're just the way our political discourse tends to be structured today.
But I think it's also not only conservative when you don't like it to have external value, it's also
you've triggered. Okay. Yeah, these are difficult topics, but I wanted, like, what I wanted to do was view some things that are, I think, happening at the moment, but from the lens of a universal history. And like when you view evolution from the perspective of billions of years, and that maybe cultural evolution right now is part of this bigger thing, which is transforming us, and like maybe in 300 years, there's some new process of evolution, which is much different than what's going on today. Then you get a different perspective on some of the things that are structuring our political discourses. And they're definitely emotionally difficult conversations, a lot of these things. Because it's about the things, because it's what it's based now, and the evolutionary worldview is much more dangerously radical than I think. Now, the only people who I think really understand how dangerously radical the evolutionary worldview is religious people. Religious people know exactly how dangerously radical the evolutionary worldview is, because what the evolutionary worldview is, it takes everything stable in the universe and it says it's going to change. So anything that you're holding on to, anything that's really important to you, it's not going to be there forever. It's going to change. And that's how dangerous the evolutionary worldview is. And that's why the modern world's been structured by this deep antagonism between religious people and evolutionary scientists.
I don't feel this antagonism. You feel this antagonism?
I've had conversations with many theologians
there are some areas where you can feel this antagonism, but it's not something global. Because religion doesn't play this role anymore as it played 100 years ago.
I mean, if you go and talk to people in real Islamic communities, or if you go and talk to people who live in real Christian communities, these are real issues, and they do not like the evolutionary worldview. They think it's destructive, and they think it's
special communities.
And here, even though in my thesis I tried to deploy the evolutionary worldview, I am in no way saying the religious worldview is stupid. The religious worldview to me is not stupid, at all. Yeah.
I just wanted to throw in, I'm not sure whether I agree with you that evolution inherently predicts eternal change.
Okay.
Because you could imagine an environment that is stable, and then those species that adapt to the environment over time will come to an attractive state where they're more or less in a close to perfect adaptation. So any chance mutation would probably not survive. Now, unless you also assume that the environment changes.
Which it will.
Right.
Which it will.
But that's not, I'm not sure whether I'd see that inherent to evolution.
Like take for example, the evolutionary world. What I'm talking about is the evolutionary worldview as described by, say, something like a cosmic evolutionary worldview, or like what Daniel Dennett said as evolution as a universal acid that eats everything. So like when you take the evolutionary worldview to its, and you don't think just about biology, then that environment that you're saying has fallen into a stable attractor, well, the Earth won't exist forever. The sun won't exist forever. The solar system won't exist forever. The galaxy won't exist forever. The universe won't exist forever. It's going to go to equilibrium or something. So what it means is that like take for example the Newtonian worldview. The Newtonian worldview would say that space and time are absolute containers, and they'll never change. They're absolute. So what the evolutionary worldview does is it really, and here I'm not saying we shouldn't try to think the absolute. I think we should try to think the absolute. But what the evolutionary worldview does is it makes it very difficult to think the absolute. It really makes it difficult because the absolute space-time container is not there. The absolute God is not there. All of the fundamental absolutes have been ruptured. And that's why it's dangerous. But I think it's a provocation for philosophy. I think we should take something like Daniel Dennett's view that evolution is a universal acid, and we should try to think, is it really that evolution goes everywhere and leaves nothing untouched? Maybe not. Right? I don't know. Should we stop, or you want to bring it to a stop? Yeah. You better know.
But one is, yeah, I think we should stop. Thank you for these 2 hours of discussion.
Now is the end of my totalitarian regime. Now I'm just a normal pleb now.
So, but I wanted to tell you, if you are interested and you want to continue the conversation on a more private level, then please join us. We will for sure go for a dinner. So if you still have time, we are happy if you come with us and continue.
But the dinner won't last forever. It will inevitably change, and it will end, and our time together will end. Unfortunately, so what's the point of anything?
The other topic I wanted to raise is if you're interested in further of events of the Bertalanffy Center, meeting people like Katel or others, please leave your email with us, and I'm very happy that we can invite you. The next interesting event will be on the 10th and 11th of October, where we raise a critical assessment question about big data, what now? It's about the epistemology that lies behind the data sciences today, and what influence this has on our world views, actually, also on the development of the philosophy of science. It is a closed workshop. We will unfortunately not broadcast it on the internet this time, and it's held in German, but some of the leading scientists in Europe will join us for 2 days to discuss this question, and they are happy if they have audience who is also interested and asks such questions as we had today. So if you want to join that, hardly invited. And thank you all for coming, and thank you all for attending through our first online session. We will close it now, and I hope have a nice evening, or whatever your time zone is. Have a nice day. Thank you very much.